So thanks to the organizers, the first tier, second tier, third tier program committee people that took this paper. It's a great pleasure to present here. Clearly, it was a very successful new experiment in how we chose papers. It worked well. So this is joint work with Mark Egan, who's at Minnesota, and Amit Seru, who's now at Stanford. And what we're studying are financial advisors. And if you think about sort of professionals that advise US households in how to sort of make portfolio choices, there's quite a lot of them in the US. Just FINRA registered financial advisors number in about 650,000 in the US. If you think about how big of a part of the financial sector this is about 10% of employment in NAICS 52, finance and insurance. So this is a huge part of finance, okay? And a lot of US households use these services, which I guess we think are important because we think people making financial choices matter. The other thing that's interesting about financial advisors is that they have a terrible reputation, okay? People think that they are, if you think 48% of Americans think finance hurts the economy rather than helps. People think Uber drivers are more reliable, lawyers are more reliable, everybody's pretty much more honest than financial advisors. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer of industries in which firms are going to do what is right, you can see where financial services ranks. It's on the bottom. It's well below automotive, which, for example, has faulty ignition switches that literally kill people. They have airbags that don't deploy. They pollute the environment by lying and so on. Food and beverage, if you've ever spent any time thinking about food and beverage, terribly misleading industry. Okay, so it's quite interesting that financial services, among all of these, ranks on the bottom. So in many ways, finance has a pretty darn bad perception. And in many ways, Luigi, I think, summarized it really well for us. In his presidential address, he said, "I fear that the financial sector fraud has become a feature, not a bug." In other words, the fear is that the business of finance is fraud rather than fraud being an unfortunate side product of finance. And what's interesting, where we started this project, is there's actually not all that much systematic evidence on how much misconduct there is in the financial sector. We had some really big scandals. Those tainted the industry. And in many ways, you could think, you know what? This was all there was. A couple of big scandals, and now we think everybody's corrupt. Then you have sort of the other benchmark, and that's Luigi, who sort of says, no, fraud is what financial services firms do. There isn't that much else. So what's interesting is, as economists, we should try to bring some evidence to the data. What would we want to know? What we'd want to know first is just measure this. Okay? We'd want to measure who does how much and when. We'd want to understand if misconduct is persistent, because if people don't repeat offenses, then punishing them is less interesting than if people are repeat offenders and we have to actually deal with them. Right? We have to get the bad apples out of the industry. The last piece is, how are we going to deal with bad actors? Because if you think about it, every industry is going to have bad performers. There's bad plumbers, there's bad lawyers, there's bad doctors, there's bad financial advisors. The key question we want to ask is, are the people who are bad allowed to stay in the industry? Can they keep on providing services over and over and over again? And what we're going to focus on in our paper is on the labor market aspect of that, right? I mean, there's many different ways you can discipline misconduct. Regulators can do it, consumers themselves. We're going to think about the labor market. So what do firms do in this industry? Do people who do bad things stay in the market? Okay. The way we're going to do it is with data. And what's nice about this paper is we have data on the universe of financial advisors in the US. When I say financial advisors, I mean people registered with FINRA. Think of that as 650,000 people actively employed right now in the US, and another 550,000 people who were employed in this industry between 2005 and 2015 who are not there anymore. Okay? So quite a lot of churn in this industry. What we're going to know for these advisors is things like where they were employed. We're going to know all of their qualifications. It's going to be important when you want to think about what they're allowed to do, what they can do. What we observe is their employment histories. That's going to be really important if you think about the labor market. To the day, we're going to know exactly which firm you worked in when. Okay? The last piece that's obviously critical is disclosures. For every one of these 1.2 million advisors, we have all of their disclosures. And from these disclosures, we're going to reconstruct how much misconduct there is in the industry. We're going to take these advisors, we're going to merge them with another data set, which is the universe of brokerage firms over this whole period. That's going to be about 62,000 firm year observations. For these firms, we know there are things like size, we know their location, a lot about their organizational structure, which we actually won't exploit, but it's sort of something you want to think about if you're going to work in this area, a lot about the management. Okay? So what are we going to do? We have broadly 2 goals in this paper. Goal 1, just document stuff, measure things. Okay? We want to measure how much misconduct is there, who does it, what's the role of firms, how do people differ with misconduct and not. Okay? The second piece is going to be we're going to try to study labor market discipline. We're going to see what is the job separation rate following misconduct. In other words, if you did something bad, what's the chance that you work, A, for the same firm next year, and B, what's the chance that you keep on staying in the industry after you've done something bad? And the last piece is we're going to try to pull these findings together in some sort of an equilibrium setting. Because one thing we're going to find is that firms with a lot of bad actors seem to stay alive in conjunction with firms with a lot of good actors. So clean and dirty firms survive in equilibrium. Why in the world can that happen? Okay? Shouldn't reputation and so on fix things? So basic facts. What we're going to find is 1 in 13 advisors in the population has a record of past misconduct. Whether you think that's high or low, it's up to you, but it's 1 in 13. Okay? At some big firms, it's as bad as 1 in 5. In some US counties, you can get to 1 in 5 advisors have a record of past misconduct. People are repeat offenders. If you want to understand whether an advisor is likely to get into trouble in the future, look if they've gotten into trouble in the past. That's important when you think about whether these people should be leaving the industry or not, right? If you have someone who's done something in the past and you want to punish them to prevent future stuff, you want to know if they're repeat offenders, they are. And there's going to be large differences between firms. So firms that employ a lot of advisors with misconduct are going to stick around for a very long time next to firms who don't. So clean and dirty firms survive in equilibrium. Okay? That's going to be interesting. How does the labor market deal with misconduct? Actually, firms are in some ways very good at dealing with it. You look at an advisor, they got into trouble in year T, 48% chance they're not with the same firm in the future, next year. Okay? If you think of it as firing, high chance of firing. What's interesting is these people get rehired by other firms in the market. About 44% of them get re-employed by another firm in the same year. Now you might want to ask yourself, wait a second, why is somebody willing to hire someone who was fired from another firm for misconduct? That's puzzling. The answer is the firm that hires them is different than the firm that fired them. The firm that hires them has a lot of other advisors with misconduct. In other words, you get rematching in the market on misconduct. Okay? Let's paraphrase this as dirty advisors go to dirty firms. Okay? Misconduct, by the way, is not costless in the labor market. Even for people who get reemployed, get worse jobs that pay less and have longer unemployment spells. So there is punishment. It just works in an interesting way. Okay? And the last thing we want to talk about a little is, as I said before, why in the world can misconduct survive? The data I'm going to show you is all public. Okay? Every one of you can go look up their advisor and see what their record is. So why in the world is competition not fixing this? Why in the world is reputation not fixing this? And our answer is going to be, seems like the data is consistent with there being a subsegment of unsophisticated consumers who don't know that this data is there, don't know how to interpret it. And the way we're going to get at this is we're going to show you that firms that have a lot of advisors with misconduct likely serve retail clients. And these kind of advisors are located in regions with older, less educated people who are likely less sophisticated. Okay? So in some ways, firms either specialize on misconduct or specialize on being clean, depending on which sliver of the population they're picking off, the sophisticated or unsophisticated. Okay? That's sort of the big picture of the paper. Let's get to the data. So what do we start with? Our basic thing is FINRA broker check. I'll show you what it means, but it's going to be a universe of all financial advisors registered with FINRA from 2005 to 2015, and all firms. Jonathan, you've seen this paper 4 times. 2 new data sets in the paper now. Meridian IQ. Meridian IQ is a really nice commercial data set that has an incredible amount of detail about financial advisors, things like AUM, some ratings of their quality, and so on. So we've supplemented that. We've also pulled the small sliver of financial advisors who are registered with the SEC but not with FINRA. Even though most SEC financial advisors are registered also with FINRA, we pulled that little sliver. That's the SEC data. Then we complement this with Form ADV data, where we know a lot about firms, specifically which segments of the population they're serving. We got some LinkedIn data to measure non-pecuniary benefits of firms. We got some industry surveys so we can see what the salaries of different firms are. And then we're going to merge everything with county characteristics to see where these firms are located and what kind of populations they serve. Okay? Big picture, that's what the data is. Okay. So to get the best idea of what the data is, I want to show you what you can actually do on FINRA BrokerCheck website. Okay? To think about what you can actually find about a financial advisor, you go to FINRA website BrokerCheck, you type in the name of your financial advisor, this pops up. Okay? This pops up, you see the name, you can see broadly, oh look, this broker has passed a bunch of exams, and we know a lot of detail about which exams. That's important because it tells us what this person can actually do legally, okay? What products they can sell, mutual funds, general securities, and so on. You see their detailed employment history to the day where they worked in the industry, and their CRD number of the firm, which uniquely lets us match this data set with the firm data set. No messy matching on names, okay? And then the key thing is going to be back here, which are disclosures. What kind of disclosures does an advisor have? From there, we're going to construct our measures of misconduct. What do I mean by that? Suppose you have a disclosure. This is how it's going to look. Okay? If you go through BrokerCheck, you click on a particular disclosure, it pops up. So for example, here we have an example of a consumer dispute. It was settled. This is a category of a disclosure. And this is important because we're going to construct our misconduct measure from these categories. Okay? We're going to construct them from many other things too. Our baseline, these are the categories we constructed from. Okay? What did this person do? It's an allegation. What they did, allegation is that individuals stole money from consumers' accounts, opened accounts in customers' name without her knowledge. Does that sound familiar? And consent, and fraudulently used customers' debit card activities alleged to have occurred between a certain date. You know what product type, and then you know the monetary compensation that was paid to the consumer. That's going to be useful when we think about how big is the extent of misconduct in some dollar terms rather than just did something bad happen or not. Okay? That's kind of the idea of how this data looks, and this is public. If you want to check your financial advisor, go do so. Okay? Now, by the way, there's actually has to be a link next to your financial advisor's name, straight taking you to this record. Okay, let's get to the basic facts. First, we want to construct a measure of misconduct, then tell you how prevalent is misconduct. Are there differences across firms? Are there differences across advisors? Okay? And this is the basic thing I want all of us to get. Once we have this, we know how we measure stuff. Okay? First, focus on the column on the left. These are 23 disclosure categories of FINRA. You get everything from consumer disputes settled to things like, is there a judgment or lien against this financial advisor in their personal dealings? Do I have a personal bankruptcy and so on? Okay? We will take 6 out of 23 categories and call them misconduct. They're going to be things like if there was a consumer complaint, if the advisor settled or the advisor lost the complaint, and most of the time they settle because it almost never goes to the end, then we're going to call that misconduct. If there was a regulatory action that was finalized, we're going to call that misconduct and so on. Okay, 6 out of 23 categories. We're trying to be fairly conservative. Okay? And we can talk about how conservative we are. We do different measures and so on. The second thing I want to show you is these two columns. Okay? Let's first focus on the rightmost column. The rightmost column is a measure that says we're going to look at an advisor in a particular point in time and see if they, at any point in the past, have had a record of this misconduct. So, consumer dispute settled, 3.7% of advisors in the data have a past record of a settled consumer dispute. Okay? This tells me in any given year, 0.3 advisors get a new consumer dispute settled record. Okay? So think of it this way. If I randomly pick an advisor from a population, 3.7% are going to have a record of having a consumer dispute settled in the past. The chance that my advisor this year gets in trouble, 0.3% in this particular year. Okay? So what do you get out of this? And these are, by the way, dummies. Anytime an advisor has many disputes in one year, we count it as one. Okay? So it's one observation in a year. Did you do something in a given year, or did you do something at any point in the past? Okay? What you see is 1 in 13 advisors, about 7%, has a record of doing something we call misconduct in the past. One or more of these things. Okay? 0.6% of advisors in any given year get a new record. They've done something new that we call misconduct. Okay? That's sort of the basic stats. Okay? And we can measure this different ways. Okay? If you want to see whether these are just kind of tiny little things or are we talking real problems, the median damages granted are about 40 grand. 25th percentile is 125. The mean it's a very right-skewed thing, is in hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's some really, really big awards. But we're not talking change. We're talking real settlements. There is variation over time, and we're going to control for it. But, bless you, we don't want to think of this as just a thing that happened in a crisis. Okay? So there's stuff before the crisis. There's stuff during the crisis. There's plenty of stuff after the crisis, too. Okay? Now I think we come to the first interesting thing in terms of economics. That was measurement. Let's talk economics. Okay? Here what we have is on the x-axis, the number of times an advisor has, how many misconduct record an advisor has conditional on having a misconduct record. Okay? You'll see that a lot of advisors have only one misconduct record, but there's many that have 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay? In other words, about 40% of advisors that have a misconduct record have more than one. Why is that interesting? Remember that the baseline rate of misconduct is 0.6% a year. The chance that you do it twice randomly is really, really, really small. The chance that you do it 3 times randomly is almost non-existent. Okay? So that tells us that people are repeat offenders. Okay? If you've done it once, chances are you're going to do it again. Why is that interesting? It's interesting for a couple of reasons. First, as a consumer, it's interesting because if you understand people are repeat offenders, you may want to avoid people who have gotten in trouble in the past. It's interesting from a labor market perspective because it tells us that people were able to do things repeatedly over time. Okay? They didn't just exit the industry. They didn't get executed when they did something bad. They shouldn't probably, but we know they didn't. Okay? So people can stick around for a while after they gotten in trouble. And it tells us that from a firm's perspective, if you want to prevent misconduct, you may want to discipline it in some sensible way. Okay? But this is just the first cut of the data. If you want to see this in a more time series setting, what we do here is the following. You have a dashed line is a person's probability of getting in trouble if at time 0 they didn't have misconduct. So they didn't do anything at time 0, and then you track and try to predict what's the chance they're going to get in trouble at time 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Of course, it's the unconditional probability, 0.6%. The solid line is the person who got in trouble at time 0. They have a misconduct record. What's the chance they get another misconduct record next year? About 10%. 4 years down the road, about 4%. Even 8, 9 years down the road, you still see that it's a substantial difference between that and the baseline hazard of someone who doesn't have a misconduct record. Right? In other words, I want to predict if you're going to do it in the future. If I know you've done it now, that tells me a lot. You want to do this in a regression setting, here's what you have. Okay? We're going to try to predict if you get in trouble in a given year as a function of your prior record, aka did you do something in the past or not, dummy variable 1, 0. Here, dummy variable of are you going to do anything bad this year or not, 1, 0. First, just simple OLS with no controls. You see that if you have a record of past misconduct, the chance of doing something bad in a given year, 2.4 percentage points. Remember, the baseline hazard is 0.6. So this is substantially higher than the baseline hazard. Condition on all the things we know about an advisor, tenure in the industry, what products you have, and so on. Doesn't do much. The last column is perhaps the most interesting. In the last column, what we're going to throw in is your year, cross-firm, cross-county fixed effects. In other words, we're going to compare 2 advisors who worked at the same firm in the same location, so same office, at the same point in time, and we're going to say, what's the chance that the person with a record of misconduct gets in trouble versus a person who doesn't have a record of misconduct, they get in trouble? Again, substantially higher chance for the person with a record of misconduct. Okay? So this is not driven by different firms having different policies. We have a firm fixed effect. It's no time series event. We have time fixed effects. We have county controls.
Do you have number of customers in there?
We have a robustness. We'll talk about robustness on slide -1 before the end. Well, it's not, but good guess. Wrong, but good. Okay. So the second interesting thing you may want to ask is, I can have two models of this world. Model 1 of this world is every firm has some bad advisors. And all firms have that, and they all kind of look the same. The model 2 of the world is some firms have a lot of misconduct, some firms don't. Okay? And that'll be interesting. Why is there heterogeneity in firms? Here you just see a simple frequency plot, and misconduct rate means what's the share of advisors that you have that have a misconduct record, okay? A record of past misconduct at some point. And this is for firms with more than 1,000 advisors. So these are big firms, because small firms, the distribution is even wider, okay? And what you see is obviously there are some firms who have almost no advisors with misconduct. And there's some firms that have about 1 in 5 advisors with misconduct. Huge differences in what population of advisors you employ, okay? Who are these firms? That's interesting because it'll let us do a gut check if we're measuring something sensible. So you have firms like Oppenheimer, you have Wells Fargo Advisory Financial Network, and so on. They get about 1 in 5 advisors with misconduct. Why do I put up these firms? Because when we put the paper out, Oppenheimer was asked, so, you guys look like you have a pretty darn bad record. What do you have to say for yourself? Are these guys wrong? It's like, no, actually, we agree. We did bad things in the past, but we're working on changing, okay? And there's sort of, what's amazing is you can find 5 different quotes by their PR person all saying the same thing. Yes, we were bad in the past, but we're doing better now. And why I think this is useful is simply, if you want a gut check of, do these things make sense? The firms seem to think they do, okay?
Misconduct is only always defined by the customer?
No, it's 3 things. Customers, regulators, or employers can file a misconduct complaint. Very good, okay? I was a bit quick on that, okay? So basic facts I want you to remember. Misconduct is somewhat common and widespread. People are repeat offenders, so if you want to understand who's going to get in trouble, it's people who have gotten in trouble in the past. And clean and dirty firms, and I'm using this to make our life easier, coexist in equilibrium. And by the way, the differences in firms are persistent. It's not that firms switch in the distribution, okay? If you have a lot of advisors with misconduct one year, you're going to have a lot of advisors with misconduct the next year, and so on, okay? And that's, I think, quite interesting from a how this market works perspective, okay? So then the question is, how does the labor market work? We have repeat offenders. Clearly, people don't get kicked out of the industry. What do firms do when an advisor gets in trouble? How does the industry treat these people? So what we're going to look at is, after you get misconduct, are you at the same firm next year or not? If you're not, do you get a new job in the industry? Do you leave? And then we're going to look at where you go, okay? And this table pretty much tells you most I want you to know. Regressions just confirm that this is actually there in the data in a robust way, okay? Column 1, advisors that didn't have misconduct in a given year. The chance that they stay in the same firm is 81% next year. So in other words, 19% turnover for people without misconduct. Quite a lot of turnover in this industry, okay? These are advisors with misconduct. Chance that you stay in the same firm, 52%. In other words, 48% of advisors are not in the same job next year. So that gives you, almost a 30 percentage point difference in turnover rates. In other words, firms are in some ways very good at getting rid of advisors who get in trouble. What's interesting is that conditional advisors who are not in the same firm, the reemployment chances are actually not that bad, okay? So if you're an advisor without misconduct who's looking for a new job, or who's not in the same job as they were last year, half of them find a job in the industry next year. For advisors with misconduct, it's 8 percentage points lower. In other words, your reemployment chances are worse, but they're not that much worse. And 44% of these advisors regain employment in the industry, okay? Now I'm going to show you this with, Okay, now I'm going to show you this in regressions. It holds, okay? With all the firm fixed effects and so on. So in other words, if I look at 2 advisors in the same firm at the same point of time, in the same location, the one that gets in trouble has about a 25 percentage point higher chance of not being in the same job next year. Firms are very good at punishing misconduct. Other firms are also pretty darn good at hiring them, right? 50% chance of losing your job. If you account for misconduct, your reemployment probability goes down by about 10 percentage points. So we're still in the 40 percentage point range, okay? What you might think is that in this world, that firms just get rid of people as a knee-jerk reaction. You got a black mark, we're going to get rid of you to preserve our reputation, okay? And other firms just kind of want to hire them or not to undo this. What's interesting is actually, it's a little bit more subtle than that. if you look at two advisors, both have misconduct, but one had a bigger consumer settlement than another, so one's misconduct was presumably worse. The one with a worse misconduct gets fired with a higher chance. Okay? So firms are actually pretty subtle. Right? And the effect is not small. You go from a 25 to 75% percentile damages, change in separation rates 10 percentage points. So firms actually understand what's going on. Also on rehiring, by the way. You get the same result if you look at hires. Two advisors from the same firm, blah, 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 both have misconduct. The one that had a bigger settlement is less likely to be rehired. Okay? So the labor market kind of works in a subtle way. Okay? So the last thing I want to look at in the labor market side is, do advisors who regain employment next year escape without punishment? Okay? Is this costless? First, their unemployment spells are a bit longer. Okay? So they're unemployed a bit more. But to be honest, all that stuff comes from the extensive margin. The guys who eventually find jobs actually don't have worse unemployment. This is the most interesting one. Where do you switch to if you have a new job? What kind of reemployment do you get? Okay, so here's broadly what we do. We're going to take two advisors who worked in the same firm, same point last year. Both are now switchers. Both are looking for a new job. We're going to compare the switcher who has misconduct to a switcher without misconduct, and we're going to see what kind of firms they end up with. Do these firms have differential things? Advisors with misconduct end up in a firm that pays on average less and about 15 grand less. So pretty big monetary difference. They end up in a firm that has less LinkedIn connections. So we think of this as being a less reputable firm, kind of smaller non-pecuniary benefits. And the most interesting piece is you end up in a firm that has more advisors already with misconduct rates. In other words, you rematch. The cleaner advisors go to cleaner firms, the dirty advisors go to dirtier firms. Okay? So I think that sort of now makes sense why in the world the firms hire advisors who were fired from other firms. It's not the same type of firms. Okay. These firms that dirty advisors go to also are smaller, both in assets and in the number of advisors. Okay. So we do a bunch of things to convince you that we don't have measurement issues. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. The last thing I want to talk about is why can misconduct survive in equilibrium? Why in the world do you get clean firms with a lot of advisors with misconduct persisting with dirty firms at the same time? Okay? What we see is, remember, public information. So the way we're going to work off of is sort of Stahl and actually Bruce's work. And we're going to say, look, what we think is going on is that there are some unsophisticated consumers. And unsophisticated consumers have no clue that broker check is out there. And even if you told them, they wouldn't know what to do with it. Okay? They kind of randomly pick, they find dirty firms. Dirty firms are happy to have them because, well, they're clueless. Sophisticated consumers realize that there's dirty firms, they go to clean firms. So you can get this market segmentation. If this is the case, we should see this market segmentation on sophistication. What we find is that if you want to look at which firms employ more advisors with misconduct, it's the firms that focus on retail investors. Okay? We also see huge geographic differences in where advisors with misconduct locate. The worst county, for example, is Madison County, New York. There's a really nice article in the New York Times by Ron Lieber, who actually then went to this county and figured out what was going on. A couple of dirty firms who hired a bunch of dirty advisors. But what we're going to exploit is differences in where dirty advisors locate. And in short, if you want to predict which counties dirty advisors are going to be in, they're going to be counties that have fewer college-educated people, that have an older population, and actually a wealthier population, which is kind of interesting. But we think of as older and non-educated people as maybe less sophisticated parts of the distribution. Okay? I'm not saying this is conclusive evidence, but it's certainly suggestive that what's happening is advisors with misconduct target less sophisticated parts of the population. Okay, so I'm pretty much out of time, so let me wrap up, skip all sorts of exciting robustness stuff and so on, and just get you kind of the big picture. So we have this really large market for people who hand out advice to consumers, okay, that are supposedly helping them undo their biases and make good portfolio allocations and stuff. Okay, 650,000 in the US. What we find is that 1 in 13 of these advisors has been disciplined for misconduct. At some big firms, it's about 1 in 5. Okay? People are repeat offenders, and there's large differences between firms. Okay? So that's the basic facts. The way the labor market works is firms are good at firing advisors, other firms are good at hiring them. Okay? And we think unsophisticated investors are driving this equilibrium. Thank you very much.